Good afternoon, everybody.
Hi, Chief. How are you?
Very good, Ashley. How are you?
Good.
I'm just waiting for Robert. He must be running a little bit late here. Hi, Rob. Are you almost there? Okay. You'll see in a few minutes. All right. Okay, relax. Relax. Do we have almost everybody, Ashley?
Waiting on Rachel and Vanya, I believe. Oh, and Anula.
Oh, okay.
And Jonathan Hepner. I don't see him either.
Just excuse me for a minute. I'll be right back with you, Ashley. Got a situation out in the lobby.
Okay.
she had one of our sergeants up there apparently ago, Susan, and there was another tree that, that's hanging up in the air. That's causing her all this concern. She's now having a medical episode out there in the lobby right now.
Toxin source.
We had an officer go up there just a little while ago about the package film, so and by the time the officer got there, found it was gone. But Susan, I think you, if you have somebody up there that can look at your property, just see if they're hanging up to you, that's the safety. I appreciate that. Thank you very much. You're welcome.
Hi, Tam. How are you?
I'm good, Anula. How about you?
I'm doing okay. Trying to work off an iPad today. It's and it's a little iPad.
You look the same.
Okay, that's good. I'm in a different state, so
Can't even tell.
I'm in Massachusetts.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yes, it is. Yes, I did. Okay, so sorry to keep everybody waiting. Rob's just getting in the office. He's kind of hooked up to the computer,
Okay.
and while we're waiting for him, could we talk about the extension for the survey? Can we do another week? Is that the consensus? We feel another week should be time.
I want to do 2 weeks. We're going to meet next week, and then we have the following week off because it's Thanksgiving. What we do next week probably isn't going to matter that much, whether we have the information by next week or the first meeting that we have in December. So if we could extend it to November 30th, then our first meeting in December, we would have it compiled and ready to look at. And it would give us time to get it out to more people at this point.
Okay, and everybody's agreeable with that?
I'm good with that. Yeah, I think that's great. So, Chief, we have a new member on the Human Rights Commission, and she was. I had asked her if if people at REPCO were aware of the survey, and they were not. So, I think the extension will give everybody some more time to kind of spread the word and give folks a weekend or two to reply and fill it out.
Rachel, does that seem okay to you?
Sorry, I thought I was on mute. Must have been rustling around.
Okay.
Yes, I think the 30th sounds great.
Okay, good. Does anybody object to that or have a different opinion of what we should do?
Can you hear me?
Who's on the call? Is everyone on? I'm sorry, I can't. It's very hard to tell. No, I'm working off a little iPad.
Do that.
Oh, there you are. Okay.
So there's Tam, there's Chief, and we have, is it Shamsi?
Shamsi?
Okay.
Okay.
Daniel Helmer, Rachel, Sage, Olivia, Gabriel, and then the call-in user, I believe, is Felicia.
Okay, great. Okay, thanks. I'm sorry. I really couldn't see on this little screen.
Wonderful. Felicia was able to get call in. That makes me happy.
I gotta load it up through that presentation. It will only take a minute.
How many responses did we receive back to you, Ashley?
So far, it was 143 when I checked around 2 o'clock.
I know we have been handing them out with our food bags through Family of Woodstock, the paper copies. And to date, we haven't gotten any back on site. I'm hoping that we will, though.
Oh, thank you, Tamara.
You're
Appreciate that.
welcome. Yeah.
I'm wondering if they've gone out to the paramedics, the rescue squad, and the fire department.
I don't believe so.
Okay, I mean, you know, there's while we're looking for a rounded, I noticed on the questionnaire that it's about 85 to 90% Caucasian people filled it out, and a large number of not willing to share that demographic. And so I definitely think extending this will allow us to get a little wider conversation. And as well, I'm really looking to be able to engage community members who no longer live in the town, but would if they could, if that was what the design was set for.
Okay, so you were saying rescue squads, paramedics?
I think so. And I also believe that Brian would probably host a little envelope pile right in the pizzeria. I don't see why we couldn't put it, because I'm seeing like a lack of access. I happened to notice last week. This week just the other day, I watched the town board special meeting about the budget, and there was nobody in there. And there was like, we've done our duty, but it was like, just put it out in the paper. And, you know, and a lot of people aren't picking up the paper these days. So whatever we can do to reach out and get this out to more people during this extension, that'd be awesome. And I also wondered if there's a way that you could put the link to the committee page on the announcement on the front page, so that when people go to look at, you know, they see it right on the front page. It's awesome that it's right there. If there's a link there that says catch up and follow up, catch up and links for the meetings, etc., that link is a very that's an important link, I think, to have right on that front page.
The section that has like the welcome, this is the introduction to the survey.
Yeah, there's like a little welcome. There's like a flyer, and then there's like an introduction and a link. And if we could just add like a click here to go directly to the board page, then people would be able to like read the mandate and have that information accessible right there. That'd be super huge. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, I'll look into that. I think I did have trouble like on the last page with all the committee information, making it like a clickable link. But let me look and see if there's any other places that allow me to make it clickable.
Yeah, they were having a hard time. People were saying they were having a hard time getting the survey to be a clickable link, which was weird because I didn't have any problem with that.
Okay. Okay, I'll look in on both of those.
Thank you.
Yeah, you had to go through that.
Okay.
Are we all set for Robert to continue?
We are. I just wanted to ask a quick question about today's agenda and how we are addressing this, because what we did identify last week was that he was going to be he's discussing the basically the presentation that he provides in a 2-day forum in like a couple of hours. And so what I'm really interested, because as we are watching and we're seeing these we're going through bullet points, we're also not having a lot of time for people to understand like the full context. It's not really fair to the process of understanding how in depth he really goes, because we're not able to do that. And so I'm wondering how much of today will be discussion and how much of it is going to be going through bullet points and, flying through this presentation?
Rachel, there should be a lot less of the bullet points now, and more of the presentation today, because as I went through a lot of the law, and now we're kind of getting past that and starting to move into some of the reasoning. So at any time, if you have questions, just fire them up.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Yep.
I have a question before we get started as well.
Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Not sure if the chief is there, but I'm curious to know whether this committee would be able to go through some of this training, to kind of sit in on the training. Okay. When is the next one scheduled? Is there a date?
We don't have one scheduled yet. We can. We have to schedule soon, actually.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
All right. Terrific. Thank you.
What you want to do what we went with the Human Rights Commission. Is that
exactly.
Right?
That's what I'm thinking.
I'm thinking it would be awesome to do that. And today, if we could almost just go through the specific law that we're dealing with the policy that we're dealing with in our own community, and then maybe perhaps and I'm not saying stop action right now, but perhaps maybe give us the opportunity to have that in-depth conversation, but also the more we have to be able to be looking at our actual policy and how that will, how we'd like to see that addressed, that would be awesome. So I don't know if you want to put that off for another time, or if that's at the end of this, or how that's going to look.
Rachel, are you suggesting that that's different than the in-depth training? And
of course it is, because we had an outdated use of force policy in Woodstock, and the chief gave us the new use of force policy last few weeks ago, and we are at some point, I believe, we're supposed to be going over that so that we can understand our specific use of force policy. And so then, and again, as we've gone through, we did this last week, we were sort of like, okay, we're flying through this particular this training process, but even the officer delivering it mentioned last week, this is not giving him even a fair shake to show us what's happening.
Oh yeah. So to clarify my statement, the implicit bias training that the Human Rights Commission participated in, I thought it was pretty informative. We're not really covering much of it here. You're right. So I'm asking about that implicit bias training.
And so what I'm noting is that last week, what we noted after listening to this presentation, I had a question, which was, when does the implicit bias training part happen? And so we have two trainings that go along with this particular training. One of them is an implicit bias training, and the other is a cultural diversity training. And what was identified in my own thought right there immediately was that those trainings are given after they're given the law. So just a simple, for us to learn this, what's happening is important, but the implicit bias training itself is different than this training, and it happens after they're given the law. So when I look at that, I say, well, as a person of color, when I look at this, even right here, this training, I have a million questions. And one of the biggest ones is, what is the perspective of the officers when they're learning this? And what we learned last week was that these laws are taught to the officers first, and then they're given implicit bias training and cultural diversity training. A simple switch in that time frame would change a massive amount of it would be highly effective, right? Because you change the perspective of the people learning the law versus learn the law, then how you have to meet it right?
Yeah,
so that's why I
agree.
asked the question now, and I'm not trying to hold this up, but
I just want to make my point. I didn't get a chance to see if the committee felt that would be valuable before we go on to. I agree with you, by the way, 1,000%. I think the order is really important. I just want to get feedback on my point and whether people feel that would be helpful. And I realize that half the committee is not here, but for the half that's here, would that be helpful for us to have that option? So I guess, Rachel, it's you, me, Chief already goes through that training, and Tam, is there anybody else from our committee?
And you're talking about the implicit bias training?
Yeah.
I definitely agree. I also really want to think about the order of the training and would be really interested in where officer wellness comes in and how to identify and respond to any trauma reactions that an officer might be having, and where that finds itself in this training.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the timing, I agreed. And, to Rachel's point, that's important. And that was one of my bubbles. I made bubbles from last week's note. And I too wonder that if there's anything like that. Maybe as we go through this presentation, it'll come up. I'm not sure.
Okay.
Because just to clarify, what we're looking at right now is the use of force training. We're going through a use of force training. So what we're learning right now, or what we learned last week, was the laws. And we got a really quick run through of what that might look like as they're training, but super, super, super fast. So we don't really know how that looks. And so now, here we are, we have another week, and we're looking at these laws, but I'm just wondering where we actually learn about some of the other, we're learning about these laws, but we also have our own policy we have to look at. So those are all the things that are on my mind right now.
Right. When we do in-service, we typically cover implicit bias and the use of force. I don't remember on which order we gave it, but we do cover those items. Something. What else do we cover? On bias. And I have those presentations as well that we can go over. Those aren't as long, trust me. They're not as long. They're in service training. So that is, you're teaching young kids than it is adults. Adults are rough.
So you're saying that the implicit bias trainings are rather short? How long is an implicit bias?
It's than this because it's an in-service, meaning to say at some point they had the full implicit bias. And these are the meat of it when we do in-service.
Are they the refreshers?
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
So basically we have short optional refresher trainings is what's on the implicit bias. And how long is an implicit bias training?
Once they get the whole implicit bias, then they're given refreshers every year.
Right. So how long is the implicit bias training?
For refresher or for the actual presentation that they give?
The presentation.
Training.
For the training.
What's that?
The training, the actual training.
The whole training itself is if let's say DCJS or the county held one, it's probably I think it's 2-dayer.
Okay.
It's a 2-dayer, and it's a train-the-trainer, and they end up most of the trainer that presentation back. They give it to all of the others at their agencies first, and then the following year would be a refresher unless there's a new officer that came on that's not had it. To get the whole thing.
Okay, so when Chief said that they have optional implicit bias training and de-escalation trainings, those are optional refreshers, or is that optional?
They're actually given as annual refresher.
They're annual refreshers that are optional.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Well, no, they're
not optional.
Are they optional?
You said they're optional.
No, they're
not
annual
optional.
refreshers.
Okay.
Yeah, they're not optional.
Yeah, they happen every year.
So what are the optional trainings, Chief, that you mentioned when we asked about implicit bias and
there's really no optional trainings. We have our yearly annual trainings, and the Article 30 and the unbiased police training, and that all comes, it's like of training in different categories, that we give out, which is mandatory. It's not an option for them to have it or not.
Okay, so I'll look back on the meetings. I'll look back on the past meetings and try to figure out where that part was where you said that there was optional trainings available, and I'm wondering what those optional trainings are. If that was the CIT, if that was cultural diversity, implicit bias.
Yeah, no, they're giving those as annual refreshers. They have an option to take it, or that might just a misprint or.
Okay, so the option, so the annual refreshers are optional. This is what I'm trying to understand. Are they mandatory?
Yeah, the annual refreshers are not optional.
Okay, awesome.
They have to take them.
Thank you. That's
Yep,
what I'm.
They have to take. Just like it's like every 3 years they have to do CPR. It's not an option to do it. 2 years. I'm sorry. 2 years.
So we'll learn more of this, but this is. I'm sorry it takes so long. I'm just trying to understand the baseline.
No, that's all right. The other thing we're starting to work on was just redeveloping a hiring process. About it another meeting, we actually talked about it the other day on building a better policy for it, and more and designing questions that are kind of fit the profile of what we're looking for in a candidate. So I just want to give you guys a heads up on that and be transparent about that, because as we progress, we'll give you what we've built. So we're in the process of building it right now. We just started it. So finish up use of force. We're down to a little bit more than halfway through now. When it officer with the decision-making process and the factor and what it's meant to be by the totality of the circumstances, because it relies on all the factors when taken together rather than a reliance on one or two specific factors. And the thing to remember about totality is remember that arrest and use of force are seizures, meaning the person, you're seizing the person from moving. They can no longer move on their own. The totality of circumstances, what I like about totality of circumstances is that's how between the interview to the arrest, in that process, all the circumstances are brought to light. Why did you confront this person? What gave you reasonable suspicion that they did something wrong? What gave you probable cause that they did to that point? And these things are now reviewed. And I don't know if I mentioned it last week, but the old adage that I feared for my life, those days are over. At least here in New York State, which I thought was a great thing, is that what cops do back in the day is that they would say, I feared for my life and this is why I shot him, or this is why I hit him with my baton. But those days are now over because of the totality of circumstances. When it comes to determining the reasonableness of you, again, it goes back to those totalities. It requires a careful balance act of the rights of the individual with the legitimate interest in the government. It kind of leaves out that how the officer may feel about it, and more of the law behind it, as how much force they need in order to get compliance. The amount of force could be just a conversation, and rather than trying to amp something up. What was the option and how it was applied? That's kind of what I just said. That's the 2020 hindsight analysis, because 20 hindsight analysis it's rarely used anymore because we have these rules in place. Still out there, yeah, in certain circumstances. 90% of it comes back to these totalities. The test for reasonableness under the Fourth Amendment is not capable of precise definition, mechanical application of actually mechanically bringing them and cuffing them up and bringing them in for processing. So that's what I love about circumstances in today's police world that didn't exist 10 years ago. Moving on, the facts reasonably known to the officer time. If we go back to the RAM factors, where the guy coming out of and running around the car, as I talked about last week, and then the officers subduing him, putting him on the ground and cuffing him up, and he's flailing. And it goes back to what they knew at the time. With going back to those totalities, it comes to the severity of the crime at issue. I mean, if you back the Graham factors, what was the crime? We don't know. We don't know what the crime was. We don't know what the guy did. It's not like there was a call for an armed robbery. Whether the suspect posed an immediate threat to the safety of the officer, that gets taken into consideration. Whether the suspect posed an immediate threat to the safety of the officer or other people. And going back to Graham, his determination was because he's running around, at some point you have to stop him because he can run out into traffic. Because once the person is out of the vehicle, for instance, he's your responsibility. So if he wanders out in the roadway and you let him and he gets run over, that actually comes on the agency. Because if he's emotionally disturbed or he's, off medication, whether the suspect is actively resisting arrest or attempting to evade by flight. And again, once they're caught, how much resistance are they giving? But there's a difference between being passive resistant and actually trying to get away. Either way, you're only allowed to use the amount of force in order to subdue him. That's it. That's as far as it goes. And I know when you start talking about things, there's a gray area. There's always a lot of this stuff, but there's a gray area with that as to how force was needed. And that's where I think that the technology comes in when we use body cameras and cell phones, because I think they're huge with bad cops out there just, acting stupid. Are there articulable facts that address the necessity for force use? Is the training experience of the officer, availability of other techniques or tools, the potential for injury to citizens, officers, or suspects, and if you go back to their training and experience, they get use of force every year. They get what's all the updates of legal updates every year. So they have to be able to take what they've learned in class and signed off on, and then has to be implemented on the street. And the availability of other techniques or tools out there, that comes back to the tasers. It comes back to what you've learned in these tactics in order to, again, if you're going to arrest somebody, I'm only going to use the amount necessary to put them into custody legally. The potential for injury to citizens and the suspect, the officers, and that's huge now with defensive tactics and how it's so the injuries actually, since the new program was implemented in 2017, the injuries have come down considerably. The reason of the action is how long do we wrestle with somebody? Because once typically you get past 30 seconds, you start to get winded. And that's when injuries happen, because those fine motor skills, first thing that goes, and that's when injuries start to happen. So we want to develop a force continuum to where I know I can verbalize what I want done, way to, if need be, deadly physical force, or me get it from verbal to passive resistive to where I can cuff him up at relative ease, and then away we can go for processing if need be. But that duration is huge when it comes to Article 35. And you take, and I think it might be the next slide. Yeah. Officers, subject consideration, officer versus subject consideration. The size of the subject, the size of the officer really determines a lot when it comes to use of force. Age and physical condition. I mean, if I'm an officer that weighs 120 pounds and the suspect is 230 and he's not coming, I got to start to think, am I going to wrestle with this guy or am I going to back up? If I have no choice, yes, I'm going to have to wrestle with him. But once I start to realize that I'm about to lose, and if I lose, it's going to go bad, in itself can result in serious physical injury or deadly physical force. Okay. Amount of subjects, how many subjects do you have?
Can I raise my hand?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Okay, so I just pulled up our policy revision, and set it aside because I was just kind of quickly looking through it, and I circled a bunch of things. I sent it to the committee, but nobody had a chance to look at it or speak to it because we put it aside for this conversation or for the use of force conversation. So I'm not sure if we will be addressing that in a different conversation or this, but we are here now. So as I'm looking at this, like, and we're talking about reinvention here in this small town with a very large voice. And so I'm looking at this and I'm going, pre-assault indicators, verbal aggression, posture change, individual ignores you, pretending to become incapacitated. Everything about the pre-assault indicators gives me the chills. The verbal aggression, I understand. Posture change, what does that mean? I understand you're going to talk this out and you talk it out with them as you're breaking this all down. But all of this feels uncomfortable. And we're, again, talking about use of deadly force as like on the top of it. Like this is sort of like you are basically in a space where you have the capacity and the ability and the double indemnity to use deadly force. And we're looking right here, and this is like posture change. What does that mean? Individual ignores you.
What page are you on?
I am looking at this penal law, Article 35, officer subject consideration, right here, where we're talking right now. This isn't even on the page that I can't not see anything but you and the page. New York State Penal Law, Article 35.
Oh, you're looking at what they mean by posture is what they mean by posture. It's just it's a sign. There's going to have to be more than posture. Oh, I'm reading here. I was looking at the actually. My apologies. I was actually looking at the policy.
Right.
When they say verbal posture change and individual ignores you and pretending to be, and that's a passive. But what they mean is that if you're having a banter back and forth and the person's not complying with what you're asking them to do, and they posture, they do is they kind of just stand there and say, okay, what are you going to do about it, officer?
Right.
And that's kind of the posture.
But so as that came up in here, as you're coming up here on your list, I'm looking at this too, and I'm going deadly physical force which under the circumstance in which it is used is readily capable of causing death or serious physical injury. Okay, so we're looking at what the definitions are, and then we start looking at the definitions of that, and then we start getting, and like these are the questions that we need to be going, well, line by line, as we're looking at this policy, like what factors that may use in determining reasonableness of force include but are not limited to, and boom. And so out comes this, and we're looking at nebulous language. So as I'm listening to you speak and I'm looking at this and I'm going, pretending to become incapacitated. I could decide someone's pretending to become incapacitated and frickin' shoot them because I have the capacity to use deadly force, and I'm also doubly indemnified by the, what is that? What is it? There's so many terminologies coming out right now, right? But there's double indemnity for police officers. There is not double indemnity for civilians. And so when we're looking at language like this, it makes me very uncomfortable.
Well, when they say pretending to become incapacitated, they're talking about somebody who already has intent, meaning their intent is to pretend to become incapacitated and then at some point reach for the officer's gun. If they're pretending to be incapacitated, it doesn't give the officer the right to draw his weapon and say, get up. You know, he's not justified in that shooting.
Right, but he's the one who gets to make the justification based on these parameters. Correct?
What's that?
He's the one who gets to make the justification based on these parameters given to him.
He can make a decision, but justified is the other issue.
Except for that we're providing officers with extra justification. That's all, right? Because as so I just spent
I don't think they're
in an ACLU meeting the other evening where they discussed the Anula, help me here, what is the name of that policy that we sat in there for? I'll look at it right now and I'll find it. They discussed the
the link that I sent out.
Qualified immunity, right? And qualified immunity doubly indemnifies police officers. And so as we're looking at use of force policies, I want the language so tight in Woodstock that there are no questions, that there isn't any nebulous language.
You know, you got to understand, Rachel, this policy came from the state of New York. This wasn't something that I drafted up. You know, this was studied by lots of professionals from Albany, and this came out just about 2 months ago now.
Well, right, but what it is that we're being asked to, that's our bottom line, right? So do we just meet it and walk on, or do we actually look at what our community needs? Those are two different questions. We can look at the bottom line of what the state says, hey, here's a little document, keep walking. We're here to actually walk out of here with our police officers feeling supported, our community feeling supported, right? Like, and so this is where we do move into this language on a deeper level, and we do ask these questions, and we do really get clear about what the indemnification conversation is. So I'm so happy that you moved ahead. Let's talk about that. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, what the qualified immunity is, and I came back to that slide, there's a couple things that need to be in place. Is that they violate the constitutional right, that has to happen. That could be with a seizure. That right must clearly be established in law. If the case against the officer cannot be clearly established in law by the courts, then the officer will be granted that qualified immunity. And as I mentioned last week, it comes back to the defendant to prove otherwise, and that's how New York State draws the law up.
Yeah, and we're here in Woodstock, and we are reinventing law enforcement, and the governor has specifically asked us to do that. And yes, we got this is a baseline, and this is where we're at. So now we look at that and say, the officers are indemnified, and the citizens have to come up with everything they need with public defenders and maybe not the finances to handle said situation to fight those indemnities. And so I'm saying we're looking at this, we're learning how this is processed, and I'm going to go, we're talking about use of force and deadly force. I watched 2 officers in Woodstock tase a guy 3 times, and honestly, they didn't need to do it. So, like, where do we actually stop and question what those indemnities are and how we can create such tight policies that there is no mistake?
I can tell you that and you've heard this 100 times. It's not I don't perfect system, and I think what you really need to do is take all of what's at issue when it comes to what use of force to use for every individual. It's a case-by-case basis. How much was needed? Now, the officer himself, if the officer oversteps his bounds, then that's on him. He's the one that's going to get jammed for it. And a lot of cases, it comes back to the agency. If the agency doesn't have policy that clearly defines it. So it's
Bingo.
Not like the officer's going to get off on it. Or walk on violating somebody's constitutional right.
I understand you've dug into this is what you do. It's your profession. And so I'm just really wondering as we look at this, because we've seen some things, because of course the chief feels that it is his responsibility to protect his officers when it comes to formal filing of complaint, for instance. Like, his bottom line is that his officers need to be protected. But he leaves the door wide open for people to come and express what they need. But his real bottom line is that his officers need to be protected. So when I look at a use of force policy, and when I know that they are doubly indemnified by both civil and constitutional law, then I want to know that this agency is looking at every single rock, picking it up, looking underneath it, and handling it so that we aren't leaving it to our officers to, it's on him. That doesn't work for me, particularly when only 3 of our 12 to 15 people who are employed by the taxpayers of Woodstock, New York, what we have to leave it up to them to all decide. We only know 3 of them, 4 with the chief. We're getting to know you.
Well, and you mean if person against officers for excessive force are investigated?
I'm saying no. I'm saying just in the simple conversation about how does a community feel about their ability to file a formal complaint about an officer. Right now, the system setup is, from what we were explained 2 weeks ago, the door is always open. Anyone can come and file a complaint. Most of the time, they're just people venting, and we need to protect our police. That's the setup for this conversation. So do you understand where my perspective is?
Any personnel complaint that comes to his door gets investigated thoroughly. Whether it's a dog barking complaint or a use of force issue.
And so if the chief of police says on the record that generally it's just people venting and we need to protect our police, that's acceptable?
You know what?
No.
In order to take action, Rachel, not everybody wants to be put down on paper, and followed up the next step. If we take action against an officer, and in all fairness to an officer, if somebody's going to accuse them of something, they need to be willing to step forward. If we go further, to discipline them, and not just come walking it and feel that we're never going to lean on them. If it's between a person and an officer, we need that person to follow through, and not everybody has to follow through. A lot of people just want to vent, so you have to understand that. So we leave it up to the individual. We don't want anybody to sign a complaint. Some people do sign complaints, and you're able to go the next step.
And those complaints, and how are we setting that up, right? So how do we set that up? How easy do we make that for the community? Like for this survey, for instance, how much do we put it out? In this instance, how easy is that process? Do people know we have
right? If a person wanted to walk right now, Rachel,
look at.
I'd like to say something. I would like to go on with the presentation. This could go on for the rest of our time here back and forth. And I'm not sure from my perspective that this is very useful. There may be a time in the future to go over this point by point, or it may be, Rachel, to your point, that the PowerPoint gets shared with people and we can do this in a more systematic way. But I would like to allow Ron to go through the rest of this and then find a way that we could have a longer discussion with some guidelines for that discussion.
Awesome.
Thanks.
Yeah, that works. That'll work.
Yeah. Continue, Robert.
Okay. We'll talk size, physical condition, whether the subject's going to be influenced by drugs or alcohol. Subject known to have a history of violence. That's another one, because that now the officer has to be aware of that. Not only is he worried about the citizenry around him or his partner, but also is this person been known to be violent? So is my personal space okay? Subject's mental psychiatric history, because you don't know when, because you can have somebody, this has happened to me, I don't know how many times, somebody could be just having a normal conversation with you, does have a psychiatric history, and then just lose it in a microsecond. And they got to be aware of that. Anyway, some of the pre-assault indicators are those, the severe aggression and maybe a posture change, or just completely ignores or pretending to be incapacitated. Other potential considerations may include, can a resistant subject physically comply? Yeah, sure, because it's that that goes up and down. If somebody becomes resistant at one point and then becomes compliant, that's where it ends. That's where the physical use of force ends. The subject understand the commands? And this is another one that we don't deal with too much, but we have, is recognizing that excited delirium. And there's a lot of information, and we do mental illness in the academy or in a DCGS training, that it shows the symptoms of Bell's mania, where somebody, and typically they show you the video clip of somebody just standing in the middle of the road screaming. And then the officers have to de-escalate it. You don't want to injure the person because you obviously need. So how to safely be moving somebody from behind to maybe grab hold of his arms while you get ready to put on a stretcher. Language barrier is another one. It's a huge one. I think, in my opinion, and it's not a law, it's not given in the academy, but I think that recruits should also have at least given Spanish in high school and beyond. It should be given in the academy for the most part on what some of the common words and phrases. Does an officer have the ability to engage or disengage? They have to have the ability to do that. Well, the officer's tactics, actions, and actions precipitate a higher use of force, and it goes back to the continuum. Well, the use of force presently appropriate will have the desired result. Yeah, you have to kind of, again, when it comes to force or how much force you're going to use, it has to be appropriate to you have. And is the officer's conduct ethically sound? Again, that's why I'm an advocate for anybody who wants to video Woodstock Police Department or body cams. Absolutely. Weapons are available to the subject, including improvised weapons, and that's where the officer has to turn to the scene and kind of look around. They always teach these guys in the academy that if you go into somebody's residence, where are most of the weapons kept? Kitchen, because why? There's knives in there. We want to make sure that nobody's wandering, that you're having a conversation face to face. And as the officer has to look around and determine what can be used as an improvised weapon. So that's going to be on his mind. The distance between the officer and the suspect is personal space. And, if you've got a good personal space of say 3-4 feet, you're okay. If you're dealing with a combative subject, your personal space may just be time and distance, where you may want to back out of that situation, because then it's a lot easier if I get help to call the person out of his house or out of his apartment to where we can sort of de-escalate it and nobody gets hurt, rather than just, be inside his residence and just, and him from getting an improvised tool by just rushing him. If we can move out and let him come out, providing there's nobody else in the house, and de-escalate it that way, that seems to work out better. Getting more time, and we'll talk a little bit about it, having more time on your side is what you really need to generate when it comes to combative subjects, is creating that time and distance. Is the action worth the potential for injury to yourself and others? Yeah. I knew a guy that in Rosendale, he had a woman sitting in the middle of 32, and you have to get her out of the roadway. So he scoops her up under her arms and he starts dragging her out of the road. And I said to him, something, Rich, if you get injured, you're a part-time guy. If you get injured, you're probably not going to get a full-time job if you injure your back doing that. Wouldn't it be a lot easier just to take 5 minutes, see what she really needs and have her move herself? To me, that made more sense. Rather than, again, rushing in and pulling them or injuring them or yourself. Then again, I talked about exhaustion. Are you injured or able to continue? Well, if you don't put yourself in that position in the first place, you're not going to become injured or exhausted or able to continue. Because again, that time, you're waiting that time, discretionary time. Objective reasonableness, the term objective reasonableness is the true and most accurate legal standard when both teaching use of force and evaluating officers' past use of force. Courts are instructed to confront the facts of the case as they were presented to the officer when the decision to use of force was made to determine the actions were reasonably given to the circumstances. And again, we talked a little bit about how much use of force can be used to where somebody's going to give a complaint against the officer. And again, that gets looked at and it has grounds, then absolutely, that's going to go to the courts. How much force did you use and was it reasonable? In Graham versus Honor, this discretionary time versus no discretionary time played a huge role in that objective reasons with again, the Graham factors. The guy jumps out of the car, running around the car, to where you have to stop him because you're not sure why he's running around the car. So you're going to apply some sort of physical force. The new one in law enforcement today is priority of life. And where in Washington Post study finds that 1/3 of law enforcement officers killed responded to calls alone. And I worked in departments where you were the only car. So the old theory is that if I'm going to a domestic, I'm going to maybe not rush to it because I'm the only officer, and I can start reasonably thinking what's going to be there when I get there. But it's that that 1/3 that ends up getting killed, and a lot of some of it's on accord, and others just because they're the only officer in that village or town. Law enforcement officers will sometimes place themselves in unnecessary risk, resulting in the need to make a split decision. And where this comes in is that if you show up to a domestic, I mean, typically what you do, you first walk up and you see if you can hear something, or if you see if you can hear somebody being assaulted, then you have no choice. You have to act. But if you can obviously have other units rolling to your scene where it's only going to take another 3-4 minutes, you're not hearing anything, it's better to have backup there with you, not only for what you're about to confront, but also for documentation. Law enforcement will not always use discretionary time when available because it may not be there. Again, if you hear somebody if you go to a domestic and you hear somebody becoming injured, you have to act. Do not follow the rules and procedures, do not wait for backup, tend to let their guard down. And that's another issue with law enforcement, is that they walk into a situation and what they thought they were walking into is now changed. The dynamics of it changed. And in a lot of cases, these suspects they'll reel them in and wait for them to put their guard down. Or you've been dealing with the same people or the same person, multiple times. You tend to let your guard down. Recognition of the fact that officers may be faced with situations where the actions and decisions of others will require a prioritization of the lives of all persons involved in order to bring the situation to a successful conclusion. I always say that, you create the time, you're going to be able to de-escalate 90% of these situations you get into. And that's my opinion. I think it's most officers' opinion. Is it everyone? Unfortunately not. And there are officers out there that do stupid things, and they're the ones that should be punished for it. Connor. We did this. Okay. The other part of life is depending on the situation. This was Columbine. Back in 1998, and I put police officers in green and innocent persons in green in that order, and criminal suspects in red, because that's the way it was back then. That has changed since. If you take a look at Parkland shooting, the new rule was innocent persons are priority, then police officers, and then obviously red's going to be criminal suspects. Because as a police officer, your job is to protect lives and property. So you signed up for that. So you're going to be number one. You're going to be number two. Number one's going to be innocent lives.
Wait, you're saying that's a new law, that it used to be police first and then?
Yeah, back here in 1998, it was when this happened in Columbine. What the rule was is that any officers that showed up on scene never went into the school. They had to wait for emergency services to show up, and they were the ones that entered the school. So regardless of how many shots were being fired, they got to enter the school.
Secure the perimeter.
All they did was secure perimeter. That has since changed. Let's just say, God forbid, something happens here. If I'm working with Greg Van de Bogart, I go to the school and we go in. That's it. We don't wait for backup to get there. We go in. Back then, in 1998 and before, it was you secured the perimeter away from emergency services. And it was actually Columbine that changed that law for the entire country.
Ron, are you saying that was a law, or you use law and rule? And I'm also wondering if that's a guideline or if that's in law.
Oh, that's the law.
Okay.
Yeah, when they change active shooter laws, because when active shooter laws is that it used to be that you assembled a team and you went in. It was a team of like four or five people, and they went in. But because of Columbine, they changed it, and now it became that you go in, period, regardless, even if you're one officer.
After Columbine, we were training with the pyramid and diamond shoot 3 officers. Then it changed up as years went by, and more of these. Now the first officer get there, you don't hesitate, you go in.
As a matter of fact, remember the Hutt Valley shooting? Everybody remembers that one? The mall shooting over there in Kingston? Yeah. When Town of Ulster showed up, they went in. There was 2 guys went in for that. They kind of knew where the shooter was, but didn't know. And they went into the last known location. So, and as other law enforcement started to arrive, that's when they started to assemble teams to go in. But yep, they had no choice. They had to. That's Patrick Sherrill. He was the guy that coined the phrase "going postal." He went to a post office in Oklahoma and shut it up. And again, it's the same. It's going back then. Now it's innocent people, law enforcement, where before it was law enforcement, innocent people. The other priority of life issue that's really coming now is, yes, innocent people, police officers, we know that, but now a person in crisis. You know, if we have somebody who could be armed, you know, we're going to make sure that our innocent people are secured first, and at that point, we start to de-escalate, or if need be, if the suspect actually starts shooting law enforcement. But it's innocent lives first, and at that point, then we can maybe move into a de-escalation situation to create that discretionary time. Brailsford, Brailsford was this guy. He ended up shooting a guy coming out of and I mentioned last week, hotel in New Mexico. I'm sorry, Arizona. This was a May 6th. And the guy, he called him out of the hallway. The guy was not given clear directions. And this guy was an emergency team and ends up shooting him because he reached around to pull his pants up. This guy ends up shooting him. That is going to, what really jammed him on that, there's a couple things right now. There's currently a lawsuit pending to Mesa Police Department at roughly $42 million. I can give you guys a presentation, and I told Reggie last week, some of these videos are graphic, if you can still get them on YouTube. I just want to put that out there if you want to watch them. But they nailed him on, primarily, was that this is his weapon that he used. And he inscribed the words, "You're F" on it. It doesn't say F on the weapon. And what he did is he actually modified the weapon. And that's a no-no when it comes to the agency. So that's why they canned him. But what they did prior to that, we don't agree with, was they made it they didn't arrest him. They actually cleared him, and but not civilly. So they went after him on a civil rights violation, and rightfully so. This is just what happened. They just spoke about. Ivan Karstick, he in the video we'll show it if you watch it. He's sort of a Mesa case, believe it or not. He was a neighborhood watch guy, and he drank. You know, he was a drinker, and he was intoxicated, and all he had on was a pole, like a 4-foot high pole, and he ended up getting shot dead by enforcement. And the payout was $1 million. But again, it doesn't bring the life back because it should have never happened in the first place. And that's another video that actually shows, and one of the things that a lot of these videos show, what you always look for, is that okay, if you shoot somebody, that's on you. But what medical did you provide him before EMS got there? Did you start working on him? Did you try and stop the bleeding? I mean, all that gets taken into consideration. We go back to the reasonableness of it or the justification of it. Again, my opinion, that was justified. They got fired, those guys.
So when it's deadly, what deadly force, when it's justified, when? Again, like the justification of deadly force.
Well, in this case here, they felt that the police felt that the guy was going to strike him with the pole he had.
So he couldn't shoot his foot because.
And that wasn't, again, watch the video, I didn't see at any time did he charge them, charge at the officers.
And when you said Mesa case, did you mean the Mesa police?
No, Mesa, Arizona.
Mesa, Arizona. I mean, you mean because they're just so classically such a horrifying police force?
Oh God, Mesa, Arizona, and some of New Mexico they are like the biggest offender.
Yes, I saw a video recently of someone tortured by the police, a black man tortured by Mesa police. So I just was wondering when you said Mesa, if that's what you were referring to.
Mesa Police Department needs to be revamped. I don't know if they did, but they need to be overhauled.
Yeah, struck down and stuff.
They need to be overhauled because there's so many cases with them. There was a Tuckawalla Police Department. This video was brilliant, and I don't even think the settlement was enough. They agreed to it. These guys, the guy wasn't. All he was an emotionally disturbed guy. He walks into a freight yard. The guys working there call the police, say this guy doesn't belong here. They show up, and rather than just de-escalate and use the amount of force necessary to, my opinion, take him to the hospital, no, they ended up tasing him and punching him, and they sicked the dog on him. And again, my opinion, they should be in jail. These cops should be in jail.
I have a few questions, and I want to make sure to get them in before time is up. Do we have a few minutes? And I also want to kind of weave in a couple of questions that folks on the call are asking that tie into this.
Go ahead.
So I'll promise to keep it short, but I do want to weave in one question now that talks about the discipline within the department for officers who exercise brutality. So how I understand that question is, well, officers who abuse their power, don't follow policy, don't follow law, what happens to them exactly?
Typically,
and that came from Shamsi.
In a lot of cases, what happens is they get exonerated through criminal, but they end up losing personal civil suits because it's sued civilly by the defendant, and then they go after their pensions and they go after their houses and things like that.
Okay.
That's what typically happens. But if you have a lot of times they'll go after the agency because of policy, because clearly written in the policy. Like you go back to Braille's with the AR-15 that he shot the guy with, they were smart enough to keep it that you can't modify the weapon, and that's what he ended up losing his job for. They canned him. He was sued later, and that's where that $75 million lawsuit civilly, but they're still going after the agency, which, in that case, absolutely. These guys here, I guarantee you they went after the agency on them as well. Absolutely.
Thank you. And I think that's a really honest question. I don't know if it answered Shamsi's question, but hopefully it did. So it sounds like civilly, folks will be able to, get an attorney and kind of follow through and get some recompense if possible. A question from me, police whistleblowers, are there any protections for a police officer who does, one in the Mesa Police Department who watches his or her other police officers be, terrible? I'm not gonna, what happens to him or her? And, hopefully, is there some kind of protection?
Yes and no. Is there some kind of protection on whistleblowers? 100%, yes, because that's law. Do I find in other agencies out there, are they ostracized? Absolutely.
Okay.
I know one in Pepsi right now who's being ostracized.
Okay. I was going to ask, why do you think, like, if there's this protection, why is there this reluctance to speak up and out? Is it that we should consider, when we get to the part of this process where we are looking at our policy, is there something that we can do and put into our policy that affords that officer a safe way to raise an issue?
Well, I think here in our town, I think it goes back to our hiring practices. That we get officers that come on that are, if something does happen, they are willing to step forward and be supported by the agency, which is another reason why I think that we don't have those issues here. We've had some people in the past. Typically what happens with bad officers in a good agency is they quit and go work somewhere else because it's not what they expected.
So there's nothing that follows that officer, like a doctor or some profession, like there's just nothing on his or her resume, so to speak. They're just free to continue to move.
That's actually all changed from new one now.
It is, okay, okay.
Now literally just recently, within this past year, their police application can be totally revoked by New York. So this year, jumping to another police department.
Okay.
That's
good to know.
And that's typically what they would happen is that they would get canned from one agency and bounce to another, because what they do is they resign. They don't get fired. They resign before they get fired. Then they're cleared. Then they can work elsewhere. There's a Cleveland case where I don't have it in the presentation. I use it for EVOC, where this guy stood out of a car and fired into the windshield. Now, who would do that? But what happened? He worked another agency and resigned rather than get fired. Went there. That's another agency's got to be. But that's typically what was happening. New York, now we have whistleblower laws. Here, new, as Chief was saying, that you have to. The officer has to. Like this case here that we're looking at this screen, the guy, whichever one it was that ended up most of the beating, the other guy, he by law in New York State has to, or else he's losing his job and face civil liabilities. 100%.
Thank you, and thanks, Chief, for that. I had one last question, but I'm going to table it for now. I'd like to give that question space to Tam, who raised something way at the beginning. If Tam, if you'd like.
Which question are you referring to?
You brought up something about the mental health of, so I'm curious about that as well.
Well, I'm interested in officer wellness and how we can promote that.
I'm glad you said that. I heard you say that before.
I think that we ask our officers to go into very traumatic, potentially traumatic situations, and having a culture that supports mental wellness in our officers is, I think, really important. I asked a question last week about, I think it was slide 32 or something, and it said something about overreaction and impulsivity as reasons for aggressive behavior, or I forget the language that was used on that slide. And it occurred to me that often one reason why people may respond that way is trauma reactions. They're not responding to the moment. There's unresolved traumas, that have cued the brain to say everything's dangerous. So it's not in their mind necessarily an overreaction. It's a reaction to unhealed past traumas. And we ask police to go into very traumatic situations without making sure that the culture itself supports officer wellness. And that's a cultural change, which I would like to see us take on also as a group.
Here in Ulster County, I'll give you at the academy level, they're given a 3-day training on officer wellness. And it's just in those things you mentioned just now, those are addressed almost as you said it. If they had something traumatic happen to them and it presents itself again, or even something that is that it starts that traumatic process and they overreact. But that's a 3-day training. And we also have a psychiatrist that we contact, one psychiatrist for multiple police agencies when it comes to traumatic things that they've seen. One in particular was, I remember there was a case in Rosendale where one of the officers found somebody hanging from a tree who hung himself. And the issue, and that's okay, they brought him down, but then he was still alive. They brought him to the hospital, and I don't want to give too much of it, but one of the people that worked in the hospital, it was their child. And this officer was there to take statements, and the person didn't want to leave her child. And that was a really traumatic incident for the officer, and they had to get help, had to get professional.
And my understanding in the past is that that's optional, and that it was optional on the part of the officer.
Actually what they do is a lot of the agencies out there, and Woodstock, I'm sure does the same thing, is that they have to, they order you to, or require you to just up and at least talk to them. In a lot of cases, they'll talk to you for an hour. In other cases, they may talk to you for days. Yep. And then if they need more help, they're going to go to more of a scheduled.
Well, and I wonder if some of these things that we're seeing, or there have been questions within this presentation, are places where there is unresolved trauma, or trauma where it was not sufficiently addressed for the healing to happen, which when we're asking people to make split-second decisions to come from a healthy place versus my brain is cued for danger, and I'm responding from a brain stem rather than a forebrain part of my system, and how we shift a culture that traditionally has said that help-seeking behavior is weak behavior. And I think that's a cultural change that isn't going to happen overnight, and it has to be sustained by lots of ways that we interact and think about this.
I mean, tell you, you're hitting on a real nerve when it comes to that in law enforcement today. 100%. That is a real nerve with law enforcement today, and it's changing. And maybe another 10 years. But and it's like you said, is that do they realize that the help is not saying you're weak? The help is going to make you stronger.
Well, how do we support help-seeking behavior within this context? And I think 10 years is frankly too long to wait. So what
honestly, that's the average.
Well, what do we as a community do to set up the support system needed to encourage this kind of pursuit of health and wholeness, really, so that one can do their job well? And we as a community need to acknowledge that we ask our police to do things that can be very traumatizing.
And
man, if you guys help put that together, man, you would set precedent.
Can I say one other thing about that, which is that we as a community are a wellness, very clearly a wellness-based community, yes. And so we have a very, as a, it's not the underground. In many it is the underground. But we have a middle ground of health and wellness and holistic healers, trauma informed. In other words, I personally, as we have this conversation, we have a member of our community who is so brilliantly trauma informed and an incredible man who could really support this department in addressing those issues right here, right in our community, less than a mile away. And these are the kind of things that we need to also encourage the movement forward into, for all of us, to deal with the traumatic issues that come up around this conversation. What I'm seeing when I look at the camera, when I look at the Zoom camera right now, is one of my people being, it looks like they're being torched, okay? The trauma and the reification of trauma that happens for someone whose community is being killed on a regular basis, to have to see that and how much and how often that is displayed for us all to see on social media, on the news and otherwise, that in and of itself reifies trauma for us and for others. And so as we look into this conversation, all of us, 2 weeks ago, we had a traumatic experience where I was upset. Anula thought I was particularly upset at her. We all left here like, I was freaking out. Like, these are dynamics that are generally occur in the old design. And we can say the same place where we sort of say, well, this is going to be difficult and it's going to take a really long time. We're being asked by the governor to reinvent this conversation. And Tamara is very correct. Our officers need support across the board, and we shouldn't just assume that they all have the ability to speak for what they need. But I'm still looking at this image of this person being harmed. I have to look at it unless I close my camera. And so we're all going through different traumatic experiences. It's not easy to deal with the fact that we do all each have implicit bias about different issues within our lives. So this trauma, this conversation is one of the most important conversations we could be having right now.
Yeah, like I said, Rachel, I'm still gonna your brain.
I'm ready. I would love to sit down, and I feel like it's time for some subcommittee.
Absolutely.
Because we need to be addressing toxic masculinity, right? We need to be addressing all kinds of levels, and this community is full of beautiful people who have the skills, but we have to have a willingness to step into some of these conversations. And so where's that guidance?
I appreciate the fact that you're frank about it.
Well, I'm frank as all heck, and everybody knew that I would be frank when I joined this committee, but they also know that I'm still here, and they can all tell me when they need me to simmer down or whatever that is. But we also have Tamara, who is actually there. I have the most context in this community as a brown human. Tamara the chief has the most context in this conversation as a police officer. We've known each other for 35 years, at least. Then we have Tamara, who has the complete and most bottom line context for what Woodstock needs, understanding what our most disenfranchised community needs. And so now we have an opportunity to look at reinventing the police force. So we can look at all these things at bottom line. It's like boys will be boys. No, boys will be the men we raise.
Absolutely.
So how do we now look and say, how do we take this conversation forward? I'm so into being here with you and going through this process, but I also feel that there's processes like if we were able to say, okay, maybe we can all sit back and look at all of these because we know that we're going through them in a short fashion, but what can we do to really look towards changing our policies and our shifts? Because we can shift here.
Yeah, I'm actually going to write that down. That's actually a good question. That we're going to actually talk about in another meeting.
Hi, Nula.
Because I kind of.
Thank you, Nula. Love you.
Let's see. Priority of life. allocation of risk involves perception. Allocated risk is currently at risk. Who's at risk? In other words, must we act now? And if so, at who? What is this? Or can we, again, going back to what I mentioned, that discretionary time. The situation reasonably appears to allow for time to consider possible available options, to where none is where, and then no discretionary time is obviously if it's an active shooter situation, or it is you roll up scene where somebody's getting beat up. You have very discretionary time, you have to act. Who anyone is at risk and what is causing the risk, and it can be all green if it's police officer, victim, innocent people, criminal suspect, person in crisis. If all currently green, then you're good. And a lot of times we get these calls where, you know, we're only going by what this is on us. So as we're going to it, we may show up and the whole thing's green. And that's how it rolled out, rather than go in expecting the worst and then you kind of act that way. Going back to the trauma of it all, is that you get these signs and symptoms and then you expect it. In fact, it can be all green, and you have to be able to bring it to the level it needs to be. And again, it's the same question, but now everything's who's at risk here? Everybody at risk? Or if you go back here, there's nobody at risk. Still going into that situation to where you have to, and typically what I do is if I'm going to call, I'm going to start thinking in my head, have I been before? What was the situation? Do I know this person? Is anybody I know have dealt with this person? And that's how I kind of roll to it. And what I've learned as far as how I enter into houses or how I enter into other areas. One thing I also teach my recruits is that you don't chase anybody in the woods, because you know that in itself creates this red. Because not only are you in danger, innocent people could be in danger. Criminal suspects or persons in crisis, they're all in danger. It's better to, at that point, to try and get more help, obviously, maybe in an emergency services situation with actually go in and try to talk the person out. Perception of risk. What is the cause of risk? If only the person at risk is also causing a risk, then you have discretionary time. And that goes back to typically a barricaded subject. That person is the only person causing that risk. You have time. You have time. You don't need to kick in doors and go in and rush the person, get them out. Typically what happens is somebody gets injured, be it the suspect or be the officer. This was can police officers be held liable under Fourth Amendment for shooting residents in their home? Yeah, absolutely. Where officers entered a home unlawfully, but where they believed it was one of a residents pointed a rifle at them. Actually, a BB gun, and it was in California. And again, overzealous law enforcement. They were supposed to go into the house, a residence, but it was on the same property. The person they're looking for wasn't there. They then enter into the yard, they find another residence, and they start knocking on the door. And this guy doesn't know who it is. He's just getting up, and he wakes up and he has a BB gun, and they ended up shooting. He lived, but that was a huge civil suit, which again, they should have lost their jobs for that one. Pinehurst was a bipolar schizophrenic, and what had happened is he went to the hospital with his sister, and they were still with the police were waiting for a commitment order. It's like it's a mental health order to go and pick the guy up, and the guy walks out and he ends up he walks out of the hospital, and then they issue a pickup order, and then he ends up, they find him. He's obviously emotionally disturbed. He's eating grass, dandelions, and he ended up wrapping himself in a pole and a light post. But again, rather than de-escalate it, they tase him. They drive stun him 5 times. He fell to the ground on his face, and he ended up dying. These guys, I'm actually not sure what happened, if they were exonerated or not. I think they were fired. That's what happened. But again, de-escalation, time and distance, That's what's taught now. Doctor had determined he was only danger to himself. Stationary, he was a non-violent person, and the force was not appropriate. And officers still granted qualifying immunity since it wasn't clearly established using a taser was unconstitutional. And this is North Carolina case. They made it illegal. Believe this is going to be illegal in New York, and it should be. Absolutely should be. If you're tasing somebody off pole, the taser is supposed to be a compliance tool. Okay, it's not supposed to be used to have someone fall off a pole. This poor woman. There's a San Francisco case. She went into again emotionally disturbed, threatened to kill her social worker. And law enforcement showed up, and initially they backed out when she drew the knife at them. They backed out of the apartment. They're kind of sitting around going to do, and they have a barrier that they have with them, and they ended up going in this time and tried to subdue her. She came at them with a knife 7 times, and she lived. Thank God. But again, that's that. What threat is she to anybody alone in her apartment? Legally does not necessarily mean should. The concept of proportionally considers whether a particular use of force is proportional to the threat facing the officers. And it going back to that totality of those circumstances. And that's what's evaluated now in situations like this. Can't go back and say some 75-year-old woman have a threat to them, especially in that situation. That's where it goes back to these totality of circumstances. I'm not sure. I know they lost their job, but I'm not sure if I'm sure the city faced a huge lawsuit when it comes to that. Officers consider that if they use an only threat, it was force necessary to mitigate the threat, and whether there is another injurious option available. Of course, there was a less injurious option available. De-escalation may be an option in some cases, most cases. You're going to use a tactical, when you go to it, you use a response, using that time to cover, to give yourself some room to have that discretionary time. A reasonable officer standard, Graham force must be judged from the perspective of the reasonable thinking officer on the scene. That's a gray area, thinking officer, rather than hindsight.
Exactly.
Yes. No two circumstances are exactly alike. They need to be judged on its own merit, based on the totality of facts of what the officer knows at the time, acting properly within the confines of the law. And it really gets broken down into, if you're showing up to the scene, when you get there, take a deep breath, relax, figure out what you're going to do. Don't just rush in and say that, well, most of the time it's these younger guys. It probably is. If you look at this, I haven't checked the stats on that as to how many actually do that, but I bet you typically it is. But we teach this de-escalation. It's important to understand how to de-escalate situations, or how you're going to respond to something where de-escalation is the first line. And that's what these guys, that's what we try to before they hit the street. What does necessary force mean? The question of necessary is based on a reasonable perception of the officer at the time, on-the-spot judgment about a level of necessary in lighter circumstances, but you've been giving in on use of force. So you need to go into those situations with the amount of training you received, and that's how it's used. Force continuum is how it's used. Reasonableness needs to be based on a split-second decision, judgment, circumstance, or intent. They are, and they rapidly evolve. But it's still going to be based on that totality of circumstances. These options available to officers affect the necessary force to be used. The less intrusive means, do you reasonably rule them out? Would they be effective in case deadly force? Did a reasonable and non-deadly alternative exist? And again, this is something that's going to be examined if there is deadly physical force being used. is it reasonable? They will take in consideration 2020 hindsight to a degree. But if you're going to take someone's life, you had better be able to follow the rules that attach to it.
Can I mention that this is part of the deadly force, the our policy? This particular section came up. It looks a little bit different. And I had circled some things that I sent out to the community. When can we address those the issues on our personal policy specifically as a committee?
Which one?
Let's finish this.
Well,
Yeah,
so
let me just
like
bang.
as we're going through this, right, I'm looking also at hours. And so some of these things are coming up, and I circled them and I sent them. So perhaps some of us, if there's a subcommittee, but we're looking at some of the same things that are in our actual 8-page or 9-page document, our actual policy. So when do we ask those questions that you're going through now, but they pertain to our policy? Are we going to have time to go over that? Should I be asking this question when Reggie's here?
I think we can make time for that, Rachel. It's obviously not going to be today. We're at the end.
Right, we're almost done
now. And I've written that down so that we can bring that back up again, whether that's a subcommittee or a meeting where we all put that on the agenda and move forward to do that together. Let's table that and bring it up and set it on one of the future agendas.
Awesome.
Yeah, I mean,
as we're flying through this, like I have a lot of questions.
Yeah. I think that would be a good way to do it.
Talk about Rachel's concerns next week.
Yeah, we can do that. Once this presentation is done, next week we'll start getting into a lot of the questions you guys may have. Did I email you guys this presentation?
No, we didn't get it.
Did you get? You didn't get? Okay, I got to do that. I got to do that.
And let's talk to Reggie. I think he has an idea for next week's meeting, so we'll find out an agenda for next week and then get it out to everybody prior to the meeting. I think.
And can we leave a space open for some agenda additions so that we can? I would like a short period of time to just bring a couple of things to the table so I can present them ahead of time, but I'd like to know if there's room in the agenda for next week. So, if there's any also a place where we can, and I will present that. What I'm going to ask of the community, of the committee, is a few very simple and very reasonable requests. And in those requests, like there needs to be a little bit of time to do that because we move from some difficult, strong, tense moments in our meetings, in the meeting, to presentation, which has been supportive. And also next week we're moving into, like, instead of just moving ahead and saying, okay, let's go forth with an agenda, is there room for space on the agenda?
I'm sure there's going to be. We certainly want to address your concerns, and the other members of the use of force policy. But it certainly do today is let Rob just finish up. If we got a few more minutes, if everybody's okay, how long do you need?
I'm just about done here. Because these are the last slides sort of go back to just recruit stuff.
Recruit stuff is important.
We're going to have in the policy.
Because I mean, when we go over this as an in-service, I mean, we cover it in a 3-hour block, and these are officers that deal with this. So you're learning about what we've learned about through the police academy and hours and hours training over the years. So it certainly takes time to learn it all, and there's a lot to it.
The final thoughts is documentation is critical in use of cases, and it is comprehensive now, as it be, on documenting use of force cases. not using force because of the underlying minor offense is critical to document in context and detail. Focus on the suspect conduct, including any warning, persuasion given to use. It's important to memorialize attempts to transfer the force decision. The use of force trap, know the levels of force and where a taser fits in, as opposed to other tools that you have in your tool belt, or the biggest tool is going to be your brain. Was also objectively reasonable under the totality of circumstances. And I always leave it with Mark Twain. It ain't what you know that don't get you into trouble. It's what you know for sure just ain't so. So that's the presentation.
Thank you very much, Robert.
If anybody wants a copy of this, shoot the chief an email like soon, and he'll bounce you out a copy of it. Again, I want to tell you that some of the videos in here, they're graphic. And I make them that way in training to get the point across.
Okay, thank you. And
Thanks, Ray.
Chief, can I put in my formal request now so that I don't have to send an extra email?
Sure. Go ahead, Rachel.
Having a hard
Yeah,
time
email.
hearing you. You're a little bit far from the mic.
Email.
You just got to email it to her. Her email should be on the Zoom.
Okay.
Yeah, he has my email from you have my email from the circular, from the committee emails, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yep.
What gets sent right over to you, Rachel?
Thank you so much.
Shoot an email to the chief, Keith at woodstockpd.org, and I'll get a copy out to you. That's requesting.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very
Thank you.
much.
Talk to you guys next week.